we get there? We can't necessarily expect students just to have those skills independently. They come to us with those skills. That's where the teaching actually comes in, that we have to provide modeling, guided instruction, collaborative opportunities, and those independent opportunities. And formative assessment is woven into all of that. I usually deliver this as an instructional model to think about I do it, you as the teacher model, then we do it together, and sometimes that's discussion board, and also collaboratively, you do it together, and sometimes that's also discussion board, but also groups, and then you do it alone independently, and sometimes that's those discussion questions. So let's take a look a little bit closer. And keeping in mind the work of Fisher and Fry and their statement that feedback does not replace good instruction. And so with that, how do we provide establishing a purpose? It's not fair to assess students on things that haven't been clearly established as important. And so when we looked at those speed up strategies, those communications, those are the things that I was sharing with you as important to establish with students what is important. Be very clear about those intentions. And then perhaps even connect the learning to the student learning outcomes. Sometimes that's done for you in your course. But if it's not, how do you share that in a more proactive way, either on the announcements page, sometimes a video, sometimes just within the discussion board saying, these are the student learning outcomes, what are some things that are going to challenge you in this week's learning? So making sure that it is relevant to students, and even as our adult learners, they need to know, why is this relevant not only to the course, but why is it relevant to the world of work? So that is part of good instruction. We can start to see some opportunities where feed up come in, but also feedback. So in addition to that, we have the opportunities to model instruction. And sometimes in the online classroom that can come from us, and sometimes that comes from outside sources. So some of you have the Pearson tools, some of the PowerPoints that are already embedded within your course, and some of you have actually taken the opportunity to create your own PowerPoints or maybe even revise or modify some of those slides to be able to demonstrate to students examples of the kinds of things that experts do in order to begin to approximate habits of mind. And so what this means is we've hired you as the professionals here at Baker and thinking how can we provide examples of what that looks like in the real world of work, but also the examples of thinking, and that's a key term there, the examples of thinking that experts do within that specific career. And so that's important. Sometimes we do that through demonstrating through video. I don't know if anyone that's present today has done a video to demonstrate something. Discussion board practice opportunities. So this includes providing additional resources, showing mathematical processes, and basically with the thinking of watch me do it and then you do it. So if we're looking at that gradual release model, you are the mentor in the room, you are the expert, you have these experiences, how can you model what that looks like for your students? And that is good instruction. So what we're doing is we're preparing students for those opportunities to provide feedback. Even in the modeling of instruction, you have opportunities to provide feedback in a constructive way. So we're going to talk about the different ways to provide that feedback. In addition, in that gradual release model is the opportunity for guided instruction. You can see the little graphic there. We have somebody that's maybe learning how to use a fire pose, but she's got some support and some guiding instruction, and this comes from questions, prompts, and cues. We often ask questions within the discussion board, but then how do we prompt students? Prompts are cognitive or metacognitive, okay? That means this might be content related or it might be thinking related, and focus on getting the learner to think. If prompts fail to resolve the misconception or error, the teacher provides a cue, and cues shift the learner's attention to a resource that may help. And a lot of you do that. You might provide a starter thread that includes the resource, but what about within the threaded discussion that you're having with students, is there an opportunity to provide a resource? That is actually a form of feedback. So that when you're noticing that students might be off track or they might want to extend their learning or extend their thinking, that's an opportunity to provide an additional resource, either organically presented, meaning created by you, or even created by another source, or dare I even say the students have created a resource that might be helpful. And finally, well, that's the opportunity to let me watch you do it, and that would be an example of the graphic that you see there. And then finally, good instruction is when we provide students with collaborative tasks and independent tasks. So how many of you use groups outside of the standard curriculum that you're teaching? Are there opportunities for your students to do groups? And maybe what that looks like. I'd love to hear some ideas. And this really means joint efforts on small projects. I've only seen a handful of faculty actually do this. And so the one example that I wanted to share with you was an instructor that kind of laid back on the discussion board, but had students do a small PowerPoint or a Google Slides together, and then they presented it together as far as the discussion board. They collaborated on it together, and then students provided feedback there. That was part of their engagement. Mary says she provides a URL to expand responses since she wants them to go back and see what they say about the resources. Yeah, I'd love to hear how you use the groups also, Mary, to share with the other members here. And this can also include discussion questions. I've made the recommendations that, you know, maybe you lump, if students have a choice on discussion questions, how can you maybe lump students and maybe assign them or have them volunteer, have them sign up for certain questions and then share them out so other students can respond. So those are just some opportunities for that collaborative online conversation and tasks. So Fisher and Fry say the key to productive group work is individual accountability. It's not about looking at a task and saying, I'll do this, I'll do this, I'll do that. It's more along the lines of how that individual accountability kind of brings back a cohesive network for students. Each member of the group must produce something based on the group's interaction. That's a key term there, is the group's interaction. So as you're thinking about those opportunities in a gradual release way, you know, we do have some flexibility for that. And those are, what we're doing is we're creating formative practice opportunities for students to engage, not only watch us, collaborate with each other, and then do things independently so that it's ripe for that feedback. So I'm just looking at the chat box right now and how Mary is explaining a milepost to help them keep moving. Yeah, so that would be a feedback. That's exactly what we're talking about, so that you can kind of coach them along the way. All right, so here's another poll that I'm going to share with you. I do have a couple of responses already. I'm going to do this okay in the chat box. And so this question is a little different. Where do you primarily provide formative feedback for students? And, you know, in the evaluation process, we always talk about formative feedback as an opportunity for students to learn from and change their practice for the next time. So, and you can vote multiple times, okay? So maybe try two. What are the maybe top two areas that you provide feedback for your students? Because I'm sure you don't just provide one way, there are probably multiple ways. And I'll give you just a few seconds to respond to that. What's interesting about the results that I'm seeing here is we have a gap in the inline comments and the feedback groups. And I say that that's interesting because we're actually going to be talking about inline comments today. That's really the bulk of our session, is seeing how we can use inline comments. I'm curious, maybe in the chat box, as to why that might be one that's overlooked. But I'm really happy to see that the discussion board is always active with an instructor present to provide feedback. As well as rubrics. You know, our courses now have been redesigned, and a lot of them have extensive rubrics. Oh, someone responded, extensive rubrics. So it's good to see that those are being utilized, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well. And some people don't use the inline comments because they don't know the feature is there or how to use it. Or sometimes they feel like, okay, if I provide feedback on the rubric, do I have to do the inline comments? Do I have to do the feedback learner? And sometimes it gets a little overwhelming. So it's really up to you to decide and balance out where you might find the most rewards on behalf of the students. And it's really challenging because for those of you that responded to the annotating rubrics, do your students know, are they fed up by you, that you're using annotated rubrics, why you're using that as a primary method, and what they should do with that information, okay? So this kind of goes back to the feed up presentation. Are you feeding them up to receive the feedback in the rubrics? And likewise with any of these, right? So if it's in the feedback to learner section, more of a holistic approach, how are your students fed up with that? And what should they do with the information once they've gathered it? So this is great. Thank you for that. So I have a burning question here at the bottom, you know, what connections do you see with feed up? Because I want you to start seeing the layers and how they're kind of accumulating one into the next. So one of the ways that feedback should be presented is that it's linked to the criteria. And I'm going to give you some sentence starters. Certain to copy them down. We are recording this session, and it will be available at a later date to look at. So, you know, this could be anywhere, quite honestly. It could be in the feedback to learner. It could be in in an email. But this is more related to an assignment or even a discussion question criteria. Looking over the feedback, one area where you shined. Okay, and so this is that promoting of a positive atmosphere. It should be rewarding for the students. But you can also change the language to include one area that I think you need a little bit more emphasis might be. So those are just some, we talk about language and crafting language here, and that's one way to do that. One of the expectations, I should say, was to, or is to, and then you might explain it, or you could even use the rubric language itself. What are some features you can add about that? Okay, so this would be identifying a gap. Looking at the criteria, here are the expectations, here's what the criteria said, and then following that up with a question. So it really puts the onus back on the student. And another way of saying that is the focus for this assignment is to. So maybe that's a broader perspective of the actual assignment. And here we have our I notice and I wonder statements, okay? But you're kind of front-loading it and making sure that students understood the criteria to begin with and that you refocus their attention on the criteria, and then you, again, continue their learning or continuing their opportunities to revisit the assignment, the criteria, as well as revisit their thinking. So I'm going to ask my burning question for the chat box. What connections are you seeing with feed up based on this opportunity to provide feedback linked to criteria? So some of you said that you wanted to create opportunities to revisit the rubrics for challenging assignments. So how might this correspond to your approach to feed up? Also thinking about the discussion boards and how students interact in the discussion boards. Might this be an opportunity to link that feed up strategy and the discussion board or engagement with linking it to criteria? Well, thanks for sharing that positive feedback, Diane, about your students engaging more in the term. I hope that's as a result of your feed up. And that's something that you can add to your action plan, some of the evidence that you're seeing. Yeah, good way to summarize that, Mary, is that feedback tells us what is coming. And do we actually do that? Do we tell them there's feedback that will be linked directly to the rubrics? Oh, that's great, Diane. I'm glad to see Ken was helpful. Okay, so here's what that might look like on the rubrics. And this is just a short rubric, and you'll notice the point allocation. This is one example that I provided. So it's really less about the content of the feedback at this point and more about the opportunities. So oftentimes Carol and I see really an underutilization of the feedback opportunities within the shareable or the commentable or the clickable rubrics, whatever language you want to use. And really, you know, even if I provided note points, that would be an opportunity. But you can see that I've provided feedback to the student, just kind of paraphrasing, if you will. And I could have gotten even more personal here with this particular student as far as their full point allocation. Yeah, so Andrea brings up a good point too. Feedback can be used for upcoming assignments. That's actually the feed forward. And thinking about what do they do with it then? So yes, those are great ideas. So you can see we're looking at the commentable or clickable rubrics in the criteria specifically. I'm not talking about the feedback to learner that's on the bottom of these clickable rubrics. I'm talking specifically about the criteria sections and how we provide feedback there. Saying good job is not going to be enough. So we need to think about how we draw upon the actual criteria, maybe summarize it, and prompt some questions, those prompts, questions, and cues. Well, that's a really good question, Mary, and I think I'll throw that back to the other members in the session. Is feedback linked to the rubric obvious? And I'm going to say not always. You know, for those strong academic students, quite possibly, but others not so much. So that might be an opportunity for your students to learn about how to use the rubrics and how you actually use rubrics, because I think people use them differently. Let's make sure there's opportunities for everyone to respond. So in addition, we can offer questions. What did you pay close attention to when, okay, so this is an opportunity to really focus on that process that we talked about last time. When thinking about this assignment, that's the process of thinking. So we may ask more metacognitive questions, and we can also talk about cognitive questions. Okay, so what do they know? But also what do they think about, and what are some of those habits of mind that we can draw upon for students and also create for students. Yeah, I think Diane's making a good point, is that they don't always read the rubric beforehand, and oftentimes they don't read it after either. So what might be some similarities and differences between? This is, you know, this is higher level thinking when students are asked to draw upon what is current and what is prior, or what is similar or what is different. And how did you know? And that really kind of prompts students to think about their own thinking. When we're asking questions, what connections do you see with the feed up, maybe that you've designed for yourself and for your students, or just even the process of feed up and feedback? Are there some connections that you're noticing? You know, these questions here are very metacognitive. And I will be honest, when I started asking more metacognitive questions of my students, they weren't prepared for that. So I really started to shift how I introduced myself and my teaching style to students. And I often said to them, I will ask you lots and lots of questions. I will ask you questions before you learn, while you're learning, and after you're learning. I will ask you questions about your thinking while you're learning. And I know that sometimes it's challenging, sometimes you might get a headache, but I'm asking you to help you think more about your thinking and why you're doing what you're doing. Yeah, that's a good point, Jim. Feedback should have noted the interactive nature of feedback, and these questions illustrate that feature. So don't feel remiss if your students don't respond or don't pay attention to, because they're probably, quite honestly, not used to it. Okay. So I told you we would talk about inline comments, and this one does demonstrate a little bit about those questions. We have 4 comments, you know, on probably a half sheet of paper. And so maybe this is what your inline comments look like. Maybe they're a little bit more brief. We can see the first sentence is very important, no matter how impressive the information or discoveries in the rest of the essay. You know, while I don't necessarily agree with the language approach to it, here's a suggestion. Try to compose a first sentence that will pique the interest of a reader. When I look at this, some of this might seem a little canned. Some of this might be like, okay, I've got a bank of statements that I want to make to students, And I want to say that although that is not my preference, I like to give authentic feedback to each student. It is an opportunity for those with large amounts of student essays and papers and projects to grade, that if you created your own set of comments or a library, if you will, of comments, that may seem appropriate for the tasks that the students are engaged in. However, I would not neglect the opportunities to get personal and individual with students. Let me share a little bit about that with you. So you can see here are some opportunities just to ask questions. This is the best place for students to receive both criteria-driven, specific feedback on the actual document and ideas, and for you to be very open and honest with students and even share additional resources with them. So that's why I was interested in the inline comments and saying, this is a formative opportunity. So the first sentence is very important, and no one would disagree with that. The first sentence is very important so that the student will get that information and hopefully make the adjustment the next time. So the last way that we may provide feedback is through verbal feedback, and I've shared with you those sentence starters. Those are really general sentence starters, and it does take some getting used to, but it helps create a level of curiosity. Even though we are the experts in the room, we can kind of phrase them so that it appears more inquiry-based as opposed to expertise. And then I also am wanting to share with you some kind of creative opportunities. Earlier, maybe a couple of weeks ago, we had a session on audio feedback, and that was really helpful and really powerful for those of you that watched that. And I'll check with Carol on the link that she can provide us for that audio feedback session, because it was extremely powerful. And so there are some tools with that. I just kind of created a little Bitmoji, but I wanted to share with you the audio that kind of came along with that, and hopefully you can hear.
Hi, Stephen. I like your idea about using VoiceThread to either provide feedback in the discussion board or even for faculty to provide feedback to students on their writing. I think it's a very powerful way to kind of get to the heart of the matter without reading too much between the lines when we type things out. Thanks. Hi, Stephen. I like.
How many of you use audio feedback primarily in the grade center? I haven't seen it used very well in the discussion board necessarily, but I've seen it used in the grade center really well. So what this does is offers a very natural opportunity to provide feedback that can be both inquiry-based. You can do I notice, I wonder. You can use the sandwich method. That recording was about 17 seconds long, and it took me probably less than a minute between opening up the application and actually recording it, saving it, and then sharing it with a faculty member. So sometimes that amount of time that we take to provide feedback is actually more powerful. The students can hear the tone of your voice. It humanizes things really well for students, and it gives them the opportunity to look back into their paper. I've even seen a video feature where a screencasting, maybe a 2-minute screencasting, where the faculty member obviously has pre-read the work and then kind of goes back and says, okay, here was something good, here's something to work on, and here's something to look forward to, offering that feed up. Excuse me, that feed forward. All right, now I'm going to share with you kind of a screencast for you about how to incorporate those inline comments. And there's no audio here, but I just wanted to share with you, practice course. Here's what that might look like. So if you've never done this before using the Blackboard Crocodoc feature, we do have, you can pretty much go anywhere. You click the comment button, and your little red tab will show up. And then you can just go ahead and type in there whatever feedback, whether it's copied and pasted from another database that you have, or if it's something that you really want to provide an individual feedback to the student. You can see I've used the I wonder sentence starter for that particular one. And then you just click outside of the box. See, I've added thoughts. I really want to kind of create a dialogue with the student, and then you'll see that it's actually embedded within the actual overall comments. And I can delete that. If I decide later I look at all the comments, you know, I was repeating myself again, I can go ahead and delete that. You'll also notice in there here there's a resource that you can attach, so you can embed links in there for students to look at additional resources. So there's a lot of feedback going on in the inline comments. I think probably about 50% of the faculty actually use the inline comments. It does take a lot of work, but imagine yourself as a student, how it's so detailed and it offers the opportunity for that. I also want to share with you a feature that Baker is participating in called the Annotate Pro, and this is a Chrome-based application that we've actually subscribed to, and I'm going to show you what that looks like. Oh, this one's a lot more crisp. So I'm going to use the comment feature again and just kind of go anywhere on the screen, and then I've downloaded on the Chrome extensions, the Annotate Pro. And what it comes with is a library of a variety of like organization ideas, anything that you can see based on the criteria that you can incorporate. It does it again here, so there it is again. Click on the little A, and I searched the library. Now I'm going to look for something, maybe like organization, and it's got a bunch of different libraries in there, and it can just put it right into the paper, okay? So anytime you have a text box, so they can do this also in your clickable rubrics. Here is a link to the resource, and I'm going to go back to it just so I can look at my notes here, see if I can grab it for you. I will have to put that in the chat box. But you can see it's 11 Trees Annotate Pro. You can probably just Google that. How about I just do this? And if you'd like to explore that, there are tutorials on how to download it for Chrome, and that would be my preferred choice as opposed to using the Word. So that's a good question. How do students then see? When they look in the Grade Center, they can actually see the paper when they, just like this, they can see the paper with a commentable rubric. So they have to actually go into the paper itself and see those, see the comments that you put on the submission, okay? It's not going to, it may show up here on the actual paper. I think I'd have to do a little digging on that one, but I've seen it actually where you can download the actual paper, and it will show you the comments that you've made on the student's work. And that is the best way that students will actually get information about their paper to make adjustments. Here's another kind of screenshot of what the Annotate Pro does for you. You know, adds those comments there, and you'll notice the A that's in the corner. Just highlight the text, and it's any open space. So if you're using Google Docs at all, that would be another way to do it. It also is adaptable for Word, but we've had some hiccups with it. Okay. So we're just about finished here, and I've shared a lot of things with you, and I would love to hear your feedback. You know, what are some areas that you're noticing that you might try to provide feedback? We've talked about feedback as questions, feedback as audio, or maybe even video, using the inline comments. And we've talked about making sure that, I'm going to go back to my original slide here so we can kind of review those sessions. So verbal feedback, inline comments, feedback linked to criteria. You know, what are some things that you're thinking about now as far as the different opportunities to provide feedback to students? And then as you're thinking about that and maybe typing in the chat box to share with everybody, you know, take a few moments to open up your action plan and jot some ideas for yourself. How might you incorporate the feedback strategies covered in this session? Yeah, so Linda is making a really good statement about the inline comments. The inline comments will only work so far as you've fed up the students to pay attention to them. So that would be something that you might do an announcement or even as a discussion? How do you take the comments that you find in a paper that you've submitted? And so the questions approach, yeah, thinking about how we might promote more of that metacognition, being reflective about their process, about the task. Remember we talked about the student as well as the whole person. Those were the different levels of feedback we talked about last time. So I'm going to link to you the survey for you so that, sorry, that's me thinking out loud. I'm going to exit here and just copy and paste this for you. This is a quick survey, just to record your attendance, because your homework is really to do a lot of the thinking about the feedback strategies in this session that we've offered, and really to continue on with the learning that you've kind of gathered so far. I would be curious if anyone is thinking about using the Annotate Pro application. I'd love to work with you on that. That is something new here at Baker, and that our president is really proud of and supportive of in terms of making sure that it allows us opportunities to provide the quality feedback that students deserve on their work. Mary's going to try the audio feedback, it looks like. A couple of tips with that is some faculty need to practice. Some faculty actually want to write out their feedback. And once you get into the hang of it and it becomes habit, it becomes quite natural, actually. And I actually enjoy giving audio feedback. All right, so our next session is at noon, also on November 28th, waiting until after the Thanksgiving holiday. And I would just encourage you, if you haven't done so already, to provide feedback to your partner. And if you haven't had a chance to do that or received any communications, then let me know. Tried to move things along and got a lot of good interaction over the weekend. So just to make sure that everyone's got the link one more time, and I hope I didn't mess this up. So that you can record your attendance for this session, and that will be put into your professional development record. Other questions that are lingering out there, anything from the prior sessions or this particular one that you would like to share with us or with everybody in the chat box, I'm just going to give it a couple of minutes for everyone to have that opportunity. All right, I'm going to sign off for now. Thanks, Carol, for monitoring the chat box, and I will hope to see you next time at the November 28th.
Zajac
has left the meeting.
So you can go ahead and register for that on our faculty development website.
Diane Hughes
has left the meeting.
Ken Dauscher
Has left the meeting.
Mary Garrett
Has left the meeting. Has left the meeting. Has left the meeting.